to Everything Amy. Welcome to today's show. I have a very special guest. I have the Commissioner of the Civilian Oversight Board of St. Louis, Missouri. Her name is Kimberly Taylor Riley, and Ms. Taylor Riley is going to educate us about what civilian oversight boards do, how did it come about. So first off, Kim, I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, like what is your background, what kind of education you have, what kind of experience you have, in case anybody listening is interested in a similar career path.
Awesome. Well, it's great to be here, Amy. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to do this. This is pretty exciting from our end because we don't get a whole lot of coverage. So this will be a nice feather in our cap. So we're excited about doing it. My name is Kim Taylor Riley. I am the Commissioner of Civilian Oversight here in St. Louis, Missouri. Prior to coming here, I was a native of Nebraska. So I lived the whole of my life until just a few years ago in Omaha, Nebraska. But I came here because my spouse is here, and also because there were some opportunities that I just couldn't pass up. So I started off my work in Missouri at the Office of State Courts Administrator as their Diversity and Inclusion Manager. I was there for about a year and a half when this position at Civilian Oversight came open. I previously had my education as an attorney. I have been an attorney for 26 years as of next month, and prior to that, have a bachelor's degree in social work with a minor in criminal justice. So I've been working in the social work, criminal justice realm for some time, but primarily law enforcement over the last 25, 26 years. I was the Director of Equity and Diversity for the City of Lincoln immediately prior to coming to OSCA. So I've been doing civil rights enforcement now since about 2012. So that's how I come to be here.
Excellent. That's some background you have. I love it. So tell us exactly what is a COB, or a Civilian Oversight Board. I'm not sure that many people know that these organizations exist, let alone what they do and how they came about.
Well, we are a Civilian Oversight Board, but there are other agencies that have different acronyms. Ours just worked out to be COB. But there are other agencies that have other acronyms, but basically what we do is we work in conjunction with the Department of Public Safety, because that's the umbrella that we're under, to oversee the activities with the police department as it relates to specific things that are authorized either by statute or by ordinance. For us, there's a state statute and also a local ordinance that authorizes us to do the work that we do. But ultimately what we do is we look at investigations related to particular complaints that come from the community relative to their interactions with law enforcement. We are also empowered to review lethal force use by St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department against civilians. So that's in a nutshell what we do.
Wow, must be very interesting work.
It is. It's very challenging work also.
So tell us a little bit, how did your particular organization start? Like, was it, someone decided to establish a COB, or did you follow a model from somewhere else? If you have any of that information.
Well, I think, and I have my assistant here with me, my investigator, who has been here since the inception of the COB, because we've actually only been in existence since 2016. The ordinance that enabled us was signed in 2015. So we've only been around for about 4 years. But you might recall that there was the incident regarding Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri.
Yes.
Ferguson, Missouri is very, very close to St. Louis, Missouri. It's kind of a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. And when that instance happened, there was much uproar, there was protests, there were all kinds of movements that were afoot. And one of those was to try to establish an oversight board to look at what police function has been and to make recommendations about it going forward. So that's part of what was the impetus for starting it. But the work to begin it had begun years and years before. I believe back as far as 2000 or 2001, they were trying to establish a civilian oversight board, and they had made proposals over time. It just didn't get approved. But on the heels of the death of Mr. Brown, then there was enough push for it to actually make it over the finish line. So it got established in 2015. They actually started taking complaints in 2016.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I mean, it's unfortunate that, you know, Mr. Brown had to suffer that way, but so you think that what happened to him was basically a way to get consent to a COB?
Well, it was really trying to get city to agree to do that, because at the point that this was going on, law enforcement was, I believe, part of the state, if I'm not mistaken. Here, local law enforcement at St. Louis level was actually governed by the state. So in order to have any oversight, it would have had to come from the state level.
Wow.
Eventually, what happened was that the ordinance came through and authorized the creation of the Civilian Oversight Board. And not long after that, there was also legislation that changed the oversight of the police department from the state to the city.
Okay.
So all of those things are now in the same house. They're all under the Department of Public Safety in the city of St. Louis. But they weren't when all of this kind of started making its change.
Okay. And so what are some of the challenges that you're facing in St. Louis to maintain a COB?
Well, one of the big challenges is simply being able to gather information. The way our ordinance is written, we do not do investigations of these cases in the first instance. So when a complaint comes in, we receive it, we review it, and if there is jurisdiction, we have to refer that case over to the police department, specifically their Internal Affairs Division. The Internal Affairs Division is who actually does the investigation of the complaint. So it comes into us on a form that we call the JCCF. It's the Joint Civilian Complaint Form. It comes in on that form. Once we receive it, we assign an investigator, assign a case number, and then within 48 hours, it is shared with IAD. When IAD receives it, they review it, they assign a case number of their own, and they assign an investigator, and then they do a preliminary review. So that's how that process starts. Well, one of our difficult pieces is because we don't do the investigation in the first instance, if we get an investigation back, say it's a year from now, we get that investigation back and we say, oh, well, we would have liked to have seen the video from the grocery store where this would have occurred. Or we would like to have seen what they posted on Facebook, because a lot of these people will do a Facebook Live and post what happened. So we would like to have seen what was in that post. Well, a year later, those things aren't available. And a lot of times the folks that are filing complaints with us sometimes are transient. And so they aren't stable housing wise. They don't have a regular telephone number year to year. So when that happens, the problem that we run into is that we don't have a way to contact them back and follow up. And we can't go back and get that evidence that's now a year old or maybe older. So it's a challenge for us, because even though we may have identified that there was a deficit, we may not be able to rectify the problem.
So how do you keep moving forward with these cases if you have to wait such a long time? I mean, is it very difficult? Like, are there any workarounds that you guys have?
Well, what we've started doing is, and again, I've only been here since January, so it's hard to say what they were doing previously because I have staff here to tell me, but obviously the prior commissioner has gone on her way to another position. So it's hard to know exactly what the inner workings would have been at that point. But what I can tell you is that now we're starting to do a lot more work at the front end. So say you come in as a complainant and you say, they used excessive force in arresting me. Well, you may tell me I had injuries to my arms, to my wrist. They dragged me across the pavement, and so I had scrapes on, the front of my thighs because I was wearing shorts. And so when they dragged me, it broke the skin. You tell me that, and you say, I went to the doctor for medical treatment. My family members took pictures of my injuries. We are now starting to gather that information from you when you come in and make your complaint with us. Or if you mail it in, because of course, in the age of COVID, a lot of our complaints are coming in now by mail.
Right.
But in the event that you do that, we are reaching out to you saying, do you have photographs? And if you say, yes, I do, we ask you to send those over. Do you have your medical records? Oh, yes, I do. Please send those over. If you don't have the medical records, will you sign a release so that we can get your medical records? So that's what we've started doing, is saying, if these folks are telling us at the front end that they have these things, rather than relying on the police department to gather that information, we're starting to do it ourselves. And we're creating an arsenal of evidence that will exist with those files, so that if it's something that we have to look at later, or something that maybe the officers didn't get or couldn't get by the time they got onto the case, we will have that and be able to supplement the record with that information. So that's one of the things that we started doing.
Great. And is there any cost to filing a complaint with you?
There is not. It is free to file a complaint with us. It is free to have whatever services that we can offer. The problem is that sometimes there's an expense in doing things like gathering your medical records, or other things that people may have experienced. Sometimes it's hard for them to get the documentation without there being a cost to them. So we also have subpoena power, which makes us a little bit unique. Not every COB has that. But we have subpoena power, and because we do, we are actually able to subpoena records from other entities that perhaps it would cost you money to get. As a government entity, we can subpoena and hopefully secure it without any expense to us or to you.
Wow. That's really good to know, because I'm sure a lot of people that don't have the information that it's free to file a complaint may be deterred because of, financial reasons. So that's
exactly
excellent information. So how many people are on your board?
Well, our board has 7 people on it when it's fully staffed. Right now, we have one person that just resigned at the end of July, so we have a position to fill. So if any of your listeners out there are in the St. Louis, Missouri area and would like to serve on the COB, please go to our website and fill out an application so that you can be considered. But basically what happens is that it's a very convoluted process, and for that I apologize. But basically what happens is you fill out the application and it goes to the Board of Aldermen. The Board of Aldermen then make a determination about who they want to recommend to the mayor for appointment. Once that happens, they have, I think, 60 days to do that. Once that happens, those recommendations go to the mayor's office. The mayor gets then another 30 or 60 days to determine if there's anyone that the mayor wants to offer up for that position. Then there's an appointment made and it goes back to the Board of Aldermen to approve the appointment. So it's a very time-consuming process. We had a vacancy at the point that I arrived, and we just got our new person on board, I believe, in July. Wow. So it's a very time-consuming process, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And it's a paid position?
It is not. The board members are voluntary.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that's good to know as well, because there's no, vested interest, and they can't.
No, and there's no paycheck that's going to come from doing that. So they do need to know that it would be on a volunteer basis. All of the time that they give to the board, they give to the board for free.
Fantastic. And so tell us a little bit about what your role is, or how do you see your role as commissioner?
Well, I'm kind of the shepherd. I am the person that is in place to work with the staff to try to make sure that the board has what they need. Ultimately, what we are in place to do is to provide as much information as we can to the board so that the board makes informed choices and decisions about the cases that come before them. So I oversee the staff. I have 2 investigators, and then we have an administrative assistant that works with us also, or I guess her title is executive assistant, excuse me, that works with us to try to make sure that we stay on track and that we get everything done in a timely fashion. So we have the assistant that is basically in charge of making sure all of our paperwork is together and that it's submitted at the point that it's supposed to be. And I have 2 investigators that review those investigations that come back from IAD. They then compile a report and a summary, and they make recommendations to the board about what they think the outcomes should be. Now, the board is free to ask questions. They get all of the documentation that my investigators get, so they're free to review all of the IAD investigation as well. What my investigators do is provide a nice summary and a nice summary report that tells them what's available. This is what is being provided to you, in other words. And then they say, this is what you've kind of done in the past with similar circumstances. This is what we would recommend you do going forward. And so that's what the board gets presented with. When we have a board meeting, which is the 3rd Monday of every month, and it comes up on our website, and that's going to be really convoluted. But if you go to St. Louis.mo, st.louis-mo.gov, you'll go to departments and agencies. If you click on civilian oversight, it'll take you to that page. And when you get there, it will show you the agendas for upcoming meetings. So you'll see the agenda when it comes out. And we've been doing our meetings by Zoom because of COVID. So anybody can listen in on what happens at our meetings. We have closed sessions and open sessions. When we discuss the cases particularly, it happens in closed session. When we talk about the cases when folks can listen in, that happens in the open sessions.
So one question that I have for you, how many staff persons do you have?
There are actually only 4 of us total. So it's me, the 2 investigators, and the executive assistant. That's everybody that works in our office.
So did your team have to go through any training on police procedures or with any other agencies or departments?
Well, actually what they did was a couple things. They went to what they call the Citizens Academy here in St. Louis, and it's put on by the police department to get them a little bit familiar with the process and the procedures that the police department uses. But they also went to there's a national certifying agency, and they call it NACOLE. It's NACOLE, National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. So that is where they also went to training and got certified through them. You have to have so many hours of training through that agency in order to get certification, but it's a national certification, and both of my investigators have earned that. They've also gone for other more specific things that they happen to be particularly interested in. One of the investigators has worked primarily in corrections, so has a lot of experience in that realm. One of the other investigators has worked in the insurance industry, so they've got some experience related to that. So each one of them comes to it with their own background and experience, and then in addition to that, we're trained through the National Certifying Agency.
Wow, that's very interesting training. Also, can you tell us about after your staff does the investigation, what happens?
Well, a couple of things happen. First, the staff doesn't actually do the investigation. It comes back from IAD and they review what's been done. And they review it to make sure that everything that needs to be part of the investigation is there. So the first thing they do is review it to identify whether or not there are any deficits.
Okay.
Once they've done that, they then will reach out to IAD and say, we reviewed this and we find that A, B, and C are missing. Can you please provide that? Sometimes it's just something that they forgot to include when they sent the file over. Other times it's things that they haven't done. And sometimes they'll respond and say, well, we didn't see any need to do A because the case seemed to be more about this over here. So we didn't investigate that at all. So it's up to the investigators to identify the things that are lacking and to request, if they need to, for other actions to be taken. For instance, we just had a case where what happened was there was an allegation that there was an improper use of police department equipment, specifically the use of their computer equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the allegations. But when IAD investigated it, there were other allegations as well. They focused on those and not as much on that one. So because of that, they didn't actually verify whether or not that inappropriate use of equipment had occurred. In our instance, once we got that, it was up to the investigators to first off identify that and then follow up with IAD to say, can you go ahead and do this because we don't see that it's done here, or send the report over if you have it. The response was, no, we didn't see a reason to do that, so it's not done. So they said, okay, well, will you go ahead and do it? And they said, no, we don't see any reason to do that, so we're not going to. When they put all of that information together, when they do their report and their summary for the board, they identified that that deficit was there and that they thought that was something that was necessary in order for them to close out the complaint. The board decided that, we do want to know that. Mm-hmm. We've looked at what's here and we see what's here, but we really want to know that. Mm-hmm. So what happened was that the board has the power to authorize what they call an independent inquiry. And what that is empowering my investigators to then go and investigate the things that remain lacking.
Great.
So what has occurred most recently is that we've had 2 cases where that happened. And so my investigators are presently gathering the information that the board asked for. Once they gather that, they will put it in report form and it will be submitted to the board for review. The board will then have a chance to review it again and decide whether they think there's sufficient information. And if they do, then they decide whether or not they agree or disagree with the findings that IAD made. And they go ahead and make recommendations based upon what they find. So say this in this particular case, we'll do a hypothetical and say that what happened was that IAD said, we don't think that there's evidence that this happened. So we're making a finding that it's unfounded. But the investigators go and gather this information and actually find out that that did happen. Mm-hmm. The investigators would then encompass that in their report and it would be presented to the board at the meeting. If the board says, you know what, we are looking at this evidence and we're thinking if they had this evidence, they would have made a different finding, would have been a different outcome. The board can then go ahead and make a recommendation to the Director of Public Safety and the Chief of Police that they revisit that. Mm-hmm. And say, now that we have this additional information, we think you need to revisit this and rethink whether or not that's the outcome that you think is appropriate. Mm-hmm. They are empowered to do that. And in addition to that, the board can make its own finding. So the board can say, while IAD found unfounded, we have looked at the evidence and we believe that it should be sustained. And the board can do that as well and still make those recommendations that it be revisited, because if there was misconduct, then discipline should attach. But discipline's not going to attach if they found that the allegation was unfounded. So that's why the board would refer it back to the Department of Public Safety Director and to the Chief of Police for appropriate decisions to be made relative to discipline toward that officer if indeed he engaged in misconduct.
Wow. Well, that's a really good process because, sometimes the determination may be made by the police department that it's not founded. And so you have this opportunity to make it right. So that's great. It's like a second pair of eyes, so to speak.
Exactly. And because we're an independent entity, even though we are under the Department of Public Safety, We are an independent entity that does that review. So we don't have any particular allegiance one way or the other. We are a neutral fact finder. And that's why we are empowered to do some of these things, because in the event we would see something that needed to be addressed, it gives the board the opportunity to address it, whether or not everybody else agrees with us.
That's great, because that gives you impartiality in this process.
Exactly.
Excellent. So tell us a little bit about the types of complaints that you have jurisdiction over.
What we have jurisdiction over are cases against the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. And that's important because there are a number of law enforcement agencies in this area. We only have jurisdiction over the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. So it has to be an officer from there for us to have any jurisdiction at all. And then it has to do with allegations about excessive use of force, abuse of authority, sexual harassment and assault, discourtesy, racial profiling, or use of offensive language that's tied to a protected class. So something like your sexual orientation or your national origin, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where our jurisdiction lies. But we also have jurisdiction to review lethal force cases, and those are separate from the laundry list I just gave you. So the lethal force cases come in simply because they're lethal force cases. You don't have to have any kind of complaint in order for us to review those cases.
Oh, that's great. So, where do you take complaints, and where do you take calls, or do you take calls?
Absolutely. We are at 1520 Market Street. We're in suite number 4029. It's St. Louis, Missouri. 63103 is our zip code. The direct number to our office is 314-657-1600. So if people have questions, they can certainly call that number and we can answer any questions they have. We are also available online. They can file complaints online. The complaint is available there. Unfortunately, it's not a fill-in form as much as we'd like it to be. So instead, what happens is that they have to print it off and fill it out, and then they can mail it in, or they can bring it into our office and talk with one of the investigators at that time.
If I, for example, came and I filed a complaint with you in the COB, am I able to file anywhere else? Like, could I go and file a complaint, with the police directly? So am I limited to one or the other, or how does that work?
No. And it's kind of convoluted, but basically we have what I mentioned before, the Joint Civilian Complaint Form, the JCCF. That form is the one that's available on our website. And if you filed a complaint on that form and you sent it into IAD, IAD is obligated to share that with us. So if it comes in on that JCCF, they're going to send a copy to us and let us know that Amy filed a complaint. Here's the problem. If you go to IAD directly and you're going to file a complaint with IAD, so you go there and say, I had a problem with a police officer, I want to file a complaint. What happens is that they will give you their form, which is an IAD complaint form. It's not the JCCF. If you file it on the IAD complaint form, they will not share it with us.
Oh.
You are not precluded from filing a complaint with IAD and then coming over to our office and filing a complaint with us as well. You're not precluded from doing that. But a lot of times people think if they filed with one, they filed with both. If you do that with us, you have. But if you do that with IAD, unless you file it on that form, you have not. We are working to change that, but that's the circumstance presently.
Oh, yeah, that makes a big difference, because most people won't know to ask for one form or the other, and I'm sure they'll just take whatever form they're given. So
Exactly.
yeah, that's definitely a challenge. Can you take us through a complaint? So like, what would it be like, say from like step one all the way through to the end?
We actually worked on a flow chart to explain the process of complaints. This is what the flow chart looks like.
Tell us about that. How does it start? What happens? What do I have to do if I file a complaint? What is my responsibility? And then how does it end up, ending? How do you close the case?
Well, ultimately what happens is a civilian resident, member of the city, sometimes it's not even somebody who lives in the city, it might be somebody who's traveling through the city that happens to have an interaction with law enforcement that they think is objectionable. Once that happens, as long as it falls within our umbrella, under our list of things that we are able to review, they can file a complaint with our office. And again, when they file with us, it comes in on that JCCF that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. In the event that you file your complaint, say you come in, you're new, you haven't lived here, you're passing through and you have an issue. You go down to the police station and you say, I want to file a complaint. They will likely give you the IAD form. You would go ahead and fill out the form and you would turn that in. Once you fill out the form and turn that in, it would go through the internal IAD process. I don't know what that process is for sure because we're not part of it. If it comes in under that JCCF form, then it comes to my office and we will review it. In the event that, say, it happened at the campus at St. Louis University, so it wasn't an SLMPD officer, it was a campus police officer, then we would reject that complaint and refer you to the campus folks for you to file your complaint with them. In the event you have a complaint that falls under our umbrella that's against an officer that works for SLMPD, then we would take your complaint and process it. So we review it, we assign an investigator and a case number, and within 48 hours, it goes over to IAD. When IAD gets it, they review it, assign a case number, and they assign an investigator on their side of the fence. Once that happens, it goes to preliminary review. Their preliminary review involves them reviewing the case and generally, if there's a police report involved, and there might be, depending on what the nature of the interaction was, they'll review that. Most times anymore, it does not involve an interview or a conversation even with the complainant. At the conclusion of the preliminary review, they will then decide whether this is what they call a citizen contact or an employee misconduct report. If they decide that it's a citizen contact, that means that they have decided that the person has not alleged sufficient facts that would involve a violation of policy if it were true. Mm-hmm. If that's what they determine, they close the case at that point and send it back to the board, meaning to our staff, for review and presentation to the board. In the event that they decide that it rises to the level of what they call an employee misconduct report or an EMR, then it goes on for further investigation. So that's when they would be interviewing people. They would be gathering whatever evidence might be out there. They would be doing whatever else you'd need to do to either prove or disprove the allegation. But one of the major factors is that if it's determined to be a CC, they may or may not talk to the complainant, but they absolutely don't talk to the officer. If it rises to the level of an EMR, however, they will interview the officer, because then they will get the officer's side of the story, because the officer may be subject to discipline if the allegation is found to be substantiated. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay, so that's what happens when we get to that point. At the point that it's been 90 days and the case is not finished, meaning the investigation isn't complete, file isn't coming back to my staff, we get a notice of extension from the chief of police, who is also called the commissioner, to say that we need more time to investigate this case. I've given my people more time. We receive that notice. We don't have the power to say yes or no whether they get more time. We just get a notice that tells us they've gotten it. So, welcome to government. So then when you get to 120 days, if they still are not finished with the investigation, at that point, they're to give us a notice of extension, but they're also to tell us the reason why. And a lot of times it has to do with maybe the case has been referred to the FBI for investigation. And we have some cases that have that status. Maybe the circuit attorney's office, who would be our local prosecutor, is reviewing the case. And because they're reviewing the case, they are needing additional time because we don't know yet whether or not there's going to be a charging decision. So sometimes you have those kinds of things going on. And so when they send us the extension, they tell us, well, the FBI is investigating the case. So then we know that's why it's taking additional time.
Okay.
So once the investigation is complete, so we'll say we get to the 90-day or the 120-day and the investigation is complete. When they finish their investigation at IAD, they will then send the file over to COB staff. So that's when my staff gets it and reviews it and looks for the deficits like we talked about before.
Yes.
So my staff reviews it, looks for deficits, makes that connection, communicates back and forth if there's additional things they need. Those things happen. Once that part's done, they prepare the reports and it goes to the board for consideration. The board are the 7 volunteers that we were talking about.
Yes.
They then review all of that documentation, and during the meeting, they discuss the case, and this is what happens in closed session. The reason that most of that happens in closed session is because if it has to do with discipline, then we cannot talk about it publicly. So we have to do it in a closed session. That's when they can talk, they can use names and discuss the people that are involved in the case. And sometimes there are a lot of people involved in the case. There may only be one complainant, but there may be numerous officers. There may be numerous other people who witnessed or were around, or maybe medical people, who knows who. So because there are a number of people that may be involved in one complaint, doing it in closed session allows them to identify those people and speak freely. When they complete that discussion, it's up to the board to decide whether or not they agree, they disagree, and they want to do something with that, or they want to have an independent inquiry. In the cases that most recently we've done the independent inquiries, part of that has occurred because we said there was a deficit. This is missing. They reached out to IAD and said, this is missing. Can you please supply this? Can you provide it? They said, no, we never got that during our investigation. So then the investigators said, well, can you go get it? Because we're going to need it when we take it in front of the board. And they said, no. So when we went in front of the board, we explained to the board, this is the piece of evidence that's lacking. This is what we did to try to get it, and we still couldn't secure it. And so the board authorized the investigators to secure the lacking piece of evidence and bring that back. Mm-hmm. When that happens, then the investigators are unleashed to go gather that information. And once they get it, they will reduce it to a report and again present it to the board for decision. We also will provide that information to the Director of Public Safety and to the Chief of Police so that they are aware of what information that we've gathered and what the board wants done with it. So that's kind of in a nutshell how it happens. Let's say that we have a great case, everything goes smoothly, and the board agrees with the outcomes that IAD has recommended. If that's the case, what happens is the board says, yes, we agree. We think that this is the right outcome. It goes then to my staff who does the closing documents, closes the file, and sends notice of that outcome to the Chief of Police and to the Director of Public Safety. If they happen to disagree, but they don't feel like there's a need for an independent inquiry, or perhaps what we discussed earlier, they disagree, but so much time has passed that we now can't go get the evidence that's missing. Mm-hmm. If that would happen, then the board can say, yes, we're going to agree with the outcome. However, we would like to see these things happen in the future. And so the board has the power to make those kinds of recommendations going forward relative to similar cases. So we may not be able to resolve it with Amy's case because too much time has passed. But in the future, we want to see you do ABC when you see these kinds of cases come through. So the board has the power to do that also.
That's fantastic. So you have the power to change the process in essence.
Yes, at least to make recommendations relative to process change. We also have the ability to do that when we do our annual report. That's another requirement for our group. In ordinance, we're required to generate an annual report. So when we do that, we also have the opportunity to make recommendations in that realm, and we do that as well.
Okay, fantastic. And who does the report go to?
Well, that's the fun part. The report goes to, you guessed it, the Director of Public Safety and the Chief of Police, but it also goes to the Board of Aldermen, to the mayor, and it goes onto our website. So it'll be public facing on the website. And then if there are other entities, we have some groups that we work with on a regular basis here locally that we would share the link with them as well, so that they could go on and look at the data that's contained in there also.
Great. So for clarification purposes, exactly what is the Board of Aldermen?
The Board of Aldermen is the equivalent of a city council. I'm not sure what they have where you are, but in Nebraska, where I come from, we have a city council. The Board of Aldermen is very much the same thing. You have a group of people who are elected by their particular districts to represent the interests of those districts. If I'm not mistaken, they have 28 of them here in the city of St. Louis. At home, we only had about 9, but here they have 28 different people representing different districts all throughout the city. And they come together as that board to make decisions in the best interest of what happens to the city overall.
Excellent.
And they also work with the mayor's office. So they make recommendations to the mayor's office. The mayor's office makes recommendation to the alderman so that they can get work done in the city.
So everybody's kind of interconnected, it seems.
They are and they aren't. The board is independent of the mayor's office, and the mayor's office is independent of the alderman. However, because they both serve similar functions, they need each other to get work done. So the mayor can come up with initiatives. She might even come up with a fabulous budget, but if she can't get the board to agree, that budget's not going anywhere. So while they're independent of each other, they work together to get the work of the city completed.
So it looks like you have a working relationship with various parts of different agencies and also the police department. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, primarily because we are under that umbrella of the Office of the Department of Public Safety. Because we're under that, there are actually 10 different divisions that live within the Department of Public Safety alone. So we're associated with those groups because we're all part and parcel of the same grouping. However, we're also a city department. So because we're a city department, we function much the way the rest of the city functions. We're subject to budgetary constraints the way the city is. We're subject to things like contracting restrictions and when you have to put things out for bid and all the other things that everyone else has to do because they're a city entity. So we're subject to that, but we also work with social service agencies and public defenders and CAPCAR, which is one of the other public-facing agencies that works on social service issues related to law enforcement. So we have a broad stretch of people that we work with in addition to universities and other folks that we tap into when we need help.
Great. And about how many claims are you seeing per week, per month, per year?
Well, it depends, of course, like everything else. So when we first started, it was 2016, so we really only worked for about half a year. In 2017, they had a full year and they took in 42 complaints. 2018, they took in 39. But 2019, they only took in 25. And in this year, 2020, at this point, we've already taken in 18. And that's even with COVID.
Wow.
So it really just depends on the year and what's happening in the city at the time.
So after the whole process is done with of a complaint, does the person who filed a complaint get any notification about the outcome, any information related to them?
Well, it depends on the outcome. It really does, because if it ends up being a CC, what we're being told is the only information that the complainant gets is through our office. So when our board passes on it is when they find out, because we will send a letter from COB to tell them that.
Ah,
But if it goes to EMR, it's my understanding that the police department will send them notification, and we will send notification when our board passes on it. Basically, we work with SLMPD as a whole, but primarily our contact is with IAD. So we work directly with IAD, with the Internal Affairs Division, but we also work with FIU, which is the Force Investigative Unit. Those are the folks that are doing the investigations relative to the lethal force cases. When we need something, when I have an inquiry, we have a liaison that works with us at SLMPD. So that's who we normally direct our inquiries to. But in addition to that person, I'm in touch with the inspector of police, the chief of police if I have to. I talk to the lieutenant who's over IAD when I need information from there. And there's also a lieutenant that's in charge of FIU, and I've been in touch with him as well. So it really depends on what it is we're looking for or what it is that we need, who I send things to. We've gone as far as to have meetings, and I have had at least one telephonic meeting with legal counsel for the police department and all of these folks trying to get questions answered and to try to figure out what the internal processes are and what we need to do to make change. So it's been an experience to try to make sure that we have the right people at the table when we're trying to do something, and also that we are relaying information accurately when we're talking to the public, through our reports, or when we're having meetings with different organizations about what's happening. We want to make sure that we're giving clear and accurate information, and that assists us in doing that.
absolutely. So, are you involved with like the new officers that get trained?
We are. When the new officers come on board, they go through the academy. And I think they told us the academy is 7 months long now.
Yes.
So because the academy is so lengthy, they have a piece of it that they've carved out for us to come in and do training with the recruits. And what we do is we come in and we provide information to the recruits about who COB is, about what we do, about how they might come up on our radar, but also to explain to them why we're important and what our function is. Because ultimately what we're doing is trying to help them do what they do better. And that's really what we're here for. So if there are flaws in your process, if you're addressing things in a manner that's only going to result in difficulty on your side and on the public side, it's our job to raise those issues up and to make you aware of them. So the goal is to keep the officers from being fearful where we're concerned, where they're worried about interaction with COB, and instead to reach out to us. And so they were encouraged to contact us if they had questions or concerns, if they weren't sure whether or not something that they saw should be reported, if they were involved in something and they weren't positive about which way they should go. We certainly would be the folks that would tell them, yes, that's something you should report to your superior, or that's something that you should document. We would certainly do that. It's not a question of them filing a complaint with us as much as it's an outside ear for what they may have going on, and they may be unsure about whether or not they want to raise that with any of their peers. You and I both know when you start a new job, the last thing you want to do is end up on the radar of your supervisor.
Absolutely.
So unless it's for a good reason, you don't really want them to know you even work there. And I think that's the same for new recruits. So the outreach is also to try to assist them so that they have another resource to reach out to if they have a question or a concern about something. There's some neutral agency that they can take it to and say, hey, we had a question about this. What do I do about it? And then we can direct them as to who they can take those concerns to.
That's great. And by the way, did you see any uptick in filings due to the recent incidents in your city?
Actually, we didn't. We had quite a lot of George Floyd protests. Again, because this is the home of Michael Brown, when those things come up, it is really a touch point here. And a lot of the people feel it in such a way that they come out in droves to register their concerns about it. And that happened on the heels of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd incidents.
Yeah.
Because that happened, we had a number of people that were involved in very peaceful, displays of their concerns. But we also had folks that engaged in rioting. There was a building that was burned out, and it was right across the street from the main police station.
Ooh.
So we had a number of incidents that arose relative to that. But we did not have complaints that came into our office about civilians and their interaction with law enforcement, even surrounding those instances. We had one person that asked about, and she asked on behalf of a group, what could be done in the event that there are officers coming to respond to the protests, but they don't have their names and badges displayed. And so we did do a follow-up on that and relayed that information to the police chief and to the Department of Public Safety director to say these were concerns that were raised and people want to know what they can do with respect to that. But we haven't actually had an influx of complaints relative to their interactions with law enforcement here.
That's great news.
It is. It is.
And hopefully it's not because people felt deterred from filing, but because there was no need for it. So that's excellent news.
Well, we're hoping so. We're hoping that that's the reason. But
Yeah.
because of COVID, it's made it very difficult to have that normal relay of information. So it's hard to tell for sure why that hasn't happened. But we haven't had one complaint come in relative to that, not one.
Oh, that's great. And so you spoke about COVID. Has COVID impacted the method that open meetings occur? And how are you addressing the issue?
Well, COVID, you can give COVID credit for a lot of things. One of the things that it did was it stopped us from requiring in-person meetings. Up until then, the ordinance required that people meet in person. So our board members had to come down in person and have the open and closed sessions. Because of COVID and the risk of physical harm to people doing that, we were able to waive it by vote of the board such that it would allow them to have the meetings in this method. So we have been having Zoom meetings for the last couple of months because, of course, our board members are volunteers. A lot of them are not being required to go into their own jobs to work. So it really didn't make a lot of sense that we would require you to risk your health to come for your volunteer thing.
Yeah.
So this way we don't have to require people to do that. And that has actually opened up our meetings more because it's made it more available to members of the public to be able to take that Zoom link and click on it and come in and listen to the meetings. So they get to see who the board members are, they get to listen to the things that are being discussed, they get to hear all of the things that are on the agenda. So it really has done a nice job of opening things up in a way that people don't have to feel like they're on the spot. So if all you want to do is call into the number and listen and you don't want to have your physical presence, you don't have to. If you want to do it through your computer and just not share your video, you can, and that way you can still listen. So it has really created a nice method for people to be able to participate without having to leave their house. And I think that's really important as we move forward. Having more involved voices means that we have to come up with other ways for them to participate.
Wow, that's really interesting. So if, for example, I wanted to just listen, would I be able to do that, or is it limited only to, say, residents of St. Louis?
No, you would be able to do it. All you have to do is go on to our website and you can click on the link that will take you there. And you could zoom in. If you don't want to zoom in, you could just take, you know how they have the little phone numbers listed. You can call in on the phone number and just listen to the meeting. Now, it's only the open session. You can't do that with the closed, but
Yeah.
you can certainly listen to our open sessions from anywhere.
That is fantastic because I think maybe some of my listeners may want to be educated a little bit more and try to understand the process. And of course, we can't cover everything in 1 hour. So it would be nice, to have that option. And thank you for giving us that information. Another question that I have for you that's related to COVID also, has COVID had any impact on any outreach efforts by the civil rights and social service agencies? And also, how are you responding to that?
Well, it has impacted that. We have not been able to have any kinds of in-person meetings in that regard. So because in St. Louis, in the city of St. Louis, not the state of Missouri, but in the city of St. Louis, we have had periods of time where we were shut down.
Mhm.
And from about March to May, we were shut down. Because of that, there was no public allowed into our building. We could come in, but we were only working a skeleton crew. So out of the 4 of us, there would only be 2 here a day, and we would only be here for about a half a day, and then we would leave.
Mm-hmm.
And we would do the rest of the workday from home. So that's what was happening here in the city. So there weren't any big meetings going on with the mayor. If you go onto the website, you'll see that the mayor does her briefings by Zoom meeting now. So all of this is going on in a much different fashion. But because that's happening, the good news is that we're able to follow the link and zoom in on other people's meetings, and we participated that way. I just did one a couple weeks ago with another entity, and that was how we did it. So we did the Zoom meeting, and we talked about COB, and we talked about what we're doing and things that we're seeing in our cases, and we were able to talk to that group in this format. So that's one of the things that other groups are doing. We're hopeful, once our report is done, that it'll be a quadrennial report. So I'm very hopeful that once that report is done, that we will be able to have a session relative to that report so that we can talk about the content and we can talk about the trends that we've seen and what we think is going on, what kinds of recommendations we're making for improvement going forward. But right now, we're getting it approved. So I'm hoping that we will get it approved very, very soon. And then we will be able to talk more about the content of that, because that will talk about what the board has seen since 2016 when we started until now. And it'll take us through at least the end of 2019. We won't be reporting anything out of 2020 in this report. We'll be reporting all the way up through 2019 though.
Great. And what type of outreach efforts do you have?
Right now, what we're doing is we're participating in meetings in this kind of format. Mm-hmm. We also are going to be we're getting some kiosks that we can put in to the distribution points for the police department. They have 3 substations. And in those substations, we're going to be putting in a kiosk that has our reports in it, so that when people present to get a complaint form, they can actually pick up that JCCF form.
Excellent.
So that's one of the things we're working on. We are, like I said, working with CAPCAR. We're working with the universities. We've got an invitation to do a training in October for the Department of Education. So because it was supposed to be an in-person meeting, because they figured by October, everything would be cleared up.
Yeah.
But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So what's happening is we're going to be putting together a presentation to utilize in that training in the fall.
Great. Excellent. So is there anything else that you think we should know? Any other information that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I guess I would refer everybody to the NACOLE site. It's NACOLE. That is the national organization that I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. They have, I think, about 200 member agencies, because there are about 200 civilian oversight boards across the nation.
Wow.
So they can look at that site and see whether or not there's a COB where they are. And if there is, they can connect with them. If they're interested in serving on the board, if they want to be involved in any way, that would be a great way for them to get access to that. And through NACOLE is probably the best way to find out if you have one in your jurisdiction. Oh, and there, I guess, in other countries as well. So there you go. Didn't know that.
I didn't know that.
So national and international.
Right.
So the other thing for folks to really be thinking about is, in the event that you are aware of an instance of police misconduct, please, please, please encourage the involved folks to file complaints. We are not equipped to take third-party complaints. Our ordinance specifically disallows that.
Uh-huh.
So if someone is involved in that kind of a mishap, they need to be the person that files that complaint. If we want to make change, we have got to make sure that we are making misconduct known, because we can't make recommendations relative to behavior we're not aware of. So if you make that complaint, we will follow it through. As long as we have jurisdiction, we will follow it through. If we don't, we'll refer you to somebody who might be able to help you. But the only way for a COB or something like it to be effective is if we're aware of what's happening, so that we can make recommendations for change that really impact ongoing issues.
Great. Well, Commissioner Kim Taylor Riley, thank you so much for being on the show with us today, and we'll talk next week.